Well, the question of how all this ends is, of course, one most of us will have been asking since it all started, really. I'm pleased to say Ros is back with us. And Ros, today we got a look at how some European countries may seek to return to something like normal life.
Yes, thanks, Lewis. We've heard a lot, haven't we, about demands for exit strategies, and that's not unreasonable. These severe lockdowns are in place across much of Europe, and they were never intended as a long-term plan. Their justification was to stop escalating infection rates and to buy time for governments as they aligned their response. But there is pressure now building for these severe lockdowns to end, and that is being most keenly felt in Europe. More than 83,000 people have died there, with Italy, Spain and France recording the highest death tolls. And now the European Union is setting out a plan to ease restrictions across its members. Here's the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen.
And now comes a crucial moment that if member states start slowly, step by step, to lift measures, it's of utmost importance that they notify this to the Commission and to the neighbouring countries, so that we do not have unwanted effects. Good neighbours speak with each other.
Well, here's the BBC's Europe editor, Katja Adler, on this EU strategy.
Its response at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis was really messy. So what it's now saying to member countries is, before you start lifting your lockdowns, can you please coordinate? And don't even think about it unless the number of infections has been going down for a sustained amount of time, unless your public health system is able to deal with a spike of new infections, and unless you have the testing capacity in place to trace new infections and protect the general public, who would then be out and about. What the hope here is to prevent a new wave of infections across Europe. This is not about getting back to normal. It's about the targeted easing of restrictions and reintroducing them again, if necessary, if there's a new wave of infections.
Well, Germany has announced that some small shops will be opening next week and that schools can reopen from May the 4th. It has also, though, extended social distancing rules until May the 3rd, and it's strongly recommending the wearing of face masks in public. Now, bear in mind that Germany has a much lower death rate than many other European countries. It has more than 132,000 confirmed cases and just over 3,500 deaths. It's believed the high rate of testing in Germany has allowed officials to better manage the spread of the virus. Here's the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, on the decision to reopen schools.
Wir können nur schrittweise.
We can only start slowly with schools, step by step after May 4. It must be in smaller groups. There must be a plan for school buses, a plan for break time. So it will be a huge logistical effort and needs intensive preparation. I know how much more sacrifice this means for parents, but I believe it's necessary if we're saying we have to live with the virus during this pandemic.
That's Germany. Other countries have started introducing changes too. Denmark, for example, has reopened nurseries and primary schools. These are pictures of the Prime Minister visiting one of them. Now, she's saying she understands if some parents might decide to still keep their children at home even though the schools are open. Denmark has nearly 6,900 confirmed cases and over 300 deaths. But the government's decision is informed by the fact the number of new cases is now falling. Here's Adrienne Murray in Copenhagen.
At the moment, all other regulations, restrictions are remaining in place until around May 10th. Denmark was an early mover. It announced a raft of them around March 11th. That included shutting the borders, limiting gatherings to a maximum of 10. People have been working from home, but also a number of businesses have had to close. That's included hairdressers, gyms, bars and restaurants. Now, those will remain closed for the next couple of weeks. However, yesterday, the Prime Minister was sounding more optimistic, and she did suggest she might be able to move forward sooner than originally planned with lifting some of those restrictions that remain in place.
Now, with much of Europe on lockdown, as you may know, Sweden has been an outlier. It's chosen not to introduce nationwide restrictions. For example, here's Stockholm this week. No social distancing, as you can see, and cafes and restaurants have remained open. But the number of deaths and infections in Sweden is now higher than we're seeing in neighbouring countries, Finland and Norway. which do have restrictions in place. Well, there are now nearly 12,000 cases in Sweden and over 1,200 deaths. Go back 2 weeks ago, that figure was 282. Here's Sweden's chief epidemiologist.
The one thing that has not worked so well, and that's why the death toll has increased so quickly, is the introduction of the disease into elderly homes, and that's our big worry right now. We have always said that it's very important to protect the vulnerable population, and in Sweden it's mainly the above 70, 75s. And I think what has been shown to us is the weakness of the structure we have for elderly homes in Sweden. It's not the basic strategy that we see has failed. It's really the elderly homes' possibilities to stop the introduction of the disease into the elderly homes.
Well, Sweden's a good example of how each country has taken its own path. And though the EU is seeking to fashion a unified response, each country will also select its own exit strategy, and they're already under pressure to do so. Take the UK, for example. Here's the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, speaking to the BBC earlier.
We do need to take the public with us. We need the public to comply, and therefore they need to know that the government has a strategy for what comes next. And they need to know the government's planning for that. And I think if there's transparency and openness, you get the trust of the public. And if you get the trust of the public, it's like the compliance levels will go up. And that is a very good thing, because what the government is doing now to keep the infection rate down is the right thing, and we should support that.
Well, for its part, the government says talking about an exit before the virus has reached its peak risks confusing the public. And I should say, when Keir Starmer was pushed on exactly when he'd reopen schools, he declined to give a date. And therein lies the rub. Every exit strategy is going to be graded. The lockdowns won't suddenly stop. Their severity will be reduced bit by bit. And then the level at which restrictions are pitched will inevitably be guided by how the rates of infection and fatalities react to that easing of the restrictions. This is going to shift around, which is maybe why governments are proving reluctant to give us too many details, which they fear will then be quoted back at them down the track. Now, if you do want to understand the options available to governments in the middle of this, I'd really recommend this article. The headlines are Pandemic Summer. It's written by Ed Yong in The Atlantic, and Ed details what all experts are telling us, that options are actually quite limited. In his words, the only viable endgame is to play whack-a-mole with the coronavirus, suppressing it until a vaccine can be produced. With luck, he says, that will take 18 to 24 months. The point here being that when people talk about exit strategies, that just means exiting the strictest of lockdowns, the lockdowns that many of us are experiencing at the moment. As for a strategy of getting us back to life as normal, well, governments and scientists will have plans and ideas, but even they will admit these can be no more than educated guesses at this stage. And Lewis, there's also a lot of information we should flag on the political debates around the exit strategies, both in the UK and elsewhere, via the BBC News website.
Yeah, that's right. Playing whack-a-mole with the pandemic is some image, isn't it?